One morning in the summer of 1876, a dedicated medical doctor named Lewis Allard was walking down the long, high-ceilinged hallway of a hospital in Papeete, Tahiti. Tahiti is a beautiful tropical island located far out in the Pacific Ocean, east of Australia. Dr. Allard was a very experienced physician who spent his days treating all sorts of local residents, but a very large portion of his patients were foreign sailors. Papeete was a bustling, active port town, serving as a major stopover for international shipping and trade routes. This meant that ships of all sizes would constantly dock there, and their crews would disembark, often needing medical attention after long, arduous months at sea. On this particular morning, as Dr. Allard reached the door of his private office and reached for the handle, he heard the heavy front doors of the hospital swing open with a loud creak. He paused and looked back down the corridor to see several local police officers walking in, carrying an unconscious man on a stretcher. Just from looking at the way this man was dressed, with his rugged canvas trousers and worn leather boots, Dr. Allard could tell instantly that he was a sailor. The officers approached the doctor looking concerned and explained that the sailor's friends had found him lying completely motionless and unresponsive that morning. They said the sailor and his crewmates had spent the previous evening at a local tavern drinking heavily, celebrating their arrival on land. It had been a long, wild night of excess, and when morning came, his friends tried to wake him up. But he would not budge. Dr. Allard nodded slowly, understanding the situation all too well. Severe alcohol poisoning was a common issue in a port town like Papeete. He motioned for the officers to follow him and led them into a nearby examination room, where they carefully lifted the young man off the stretcher and laid him flat on a wooden exam table. Dr. Allard stepped up to the table to look him over. The sailor appeared to be quite young, probably in his mid-20s, and he possessed a very strong, muscular, and otherwise healthy-looking build. The doctor reached down and pressed his fingers against the sailor's wrist to check for a pulse, but he felt nothing. He moved his fingers to the carotid artery in the neck, pressing firmly, but again he felt no movement, no rhythmic throbbing of life. He leaned down close, placing his ear near the man's chest to listen for a heartbeat, but the room remained silent save for the breathing of the police officers. He checked a few more times, wanting to be absolutely certain it wasn't just an extremely weak, imperceptible pulse, but eventually Dr. Allard straightened up, shook his head, and concluded that the young sailor was dead. He suspected, based on the history given by the officers, that the cause of death was indeed severe alcohol poisoning. Now, this hospital had a very specific, standardized protocol for handling the deaths of foreign sailors who passed away while in Tahiti. Since these men had no family on the island and often very little money to their names, the doctor who pronounced them dead was responsible for arranging a quick and basic burial in a public cemetery. To facilitate this, the hospital kept a supply of cheap, unadorned wooden coffins in the basement morgue specifically for these situations. Dr. Allard followed the protocol and asked the police officers to go locate the dead sailor's friends, to inform them of the tragedy and to let them know a burial would be arranged. Once the officers left to perform this duty, the doctor walked down to the quiet, cool basement of the hospital to prepare the body and secure one of the simple pine coffins. He placed the young sailor inside, closed the lid, and fastened it shut with long metal nails, as was the custom to secure the deceased for transport. He then contacted a group of 4 local men who worked as gravediggers, instructing them to come retrieve the coffin, take it to the public cemetery on the edge of town, and bury it in a pre-designated plot. With those tasks completed, Dr. Allard returned to his daily medical duties, believing the matter was fully resolved. But a few hours later, as Dr. Allard was sitting at his desk reviewing medical charts, he heard a sudden, loud, frantic knocking at his office door. Before he could even call out for whoever it was to enter, the door swung open violently. The doctor looked up, completely startled, and saw the 4 gravediggers standing in his doorway. This was highly unusual. Normally, once the gravediggers were hired and given their instructions, they simply went about their work and the doctor never saw them again. There was absolutely no operational reason for them to return to the hospital to check in. But as Dr. Allard looked at these 4 men, he realized they were not there for a routine update. They looked absolutely terrified. Their faces were pale, their chests were heaving, and they were sweating profusely. They looked as though they had just seen a ghost. Before the doctor could even open his mouth to ask what was wrong, the lead gravedigger began speaking in an incredibly rapid, trembling voice. He explained that they had loaded the heavy wooden coffin onto their cart and had begun the journey toward the cemetery. But as they were walking down the dirt road, carrying the coffin over to the actual grave site, the wood began to vibrate. Then, the entire coffin started to shake violently from side to side, as if the person trapped inside was clawing at the wooden walls, trying desperately to break free. The gravedigger said they stopped in their tracks, paralyzed with fear, and then they heard muffled, low, agonizing moaning sounds echoing from inside the nailed-shut pine box. The men became so overwhelmed with panic that they immediately dropped the coffin right there in the dirt and ran as fast as they could back to the hospital to find the doctor. Dr. Allard listened to this wild story with a look of growing annoyance. When he had hired these 4 men earlier that day, he had found them at a local pub, and it was very obvious they had already been drinking quite a bit. The doctor knew these men were superstitious and not particularly professional, and he assumed that their alcohol-fueled imaginations were simply playing tricks on them. He figured they had probably bumped the coffin against something, or perhaps the gases from the decomposing body had made a sound, and in their drunken stupor, they had spun it into a terrifying ghost story. He sighed, rubbed his temples, and looked at the frightened men. He told them flatly that the sailor was dead. He had personally checked for a pulse multiple times and found absolutely nothing. He assured them there was no ghost and no medical miracle occurring. But seeing that the men were still too frightened to return to the coffin on their own, Dr. Allard decided to offer a compromise. He told them to go find a local police officer, bring the officer to the abandoned coffin, and have him inspect it. Once the officer confirmed the sailor was indeed deceased, the gravediggers would have to do their jobs and bury the body as agreed. The gravediggers looked at each other, still uneasy, but they nodded, muttered their agreement, and left the office to find an officer. Several hours passed, and Dr. Allard had put the strange incident out of his mind, focusing on his other patients. Later that afternoon, there was another knock on his door, and this time a local police officer entered. It was the very officer the gravediggers had recruited at the doctor's suggestion. The officer smiled and sat down, wanting to let the doctor know that everything had been taken care of. He explained that he had accompanied the 4 nervous gravediggers back to the road where they had dropped the coffin. When they arrived, the wooden box was sitting perfectly still in the dirt. The officer walked up to it, leaned down, and listened closely for several minutes. There was absolutely no sound coming from inside. It was completely silent and still. He had even knocked on the lid, but there was no response. The officer concluded that the gravediggers had indeed been letting their drunken imaginations get the best of them. He ordered them to pick the coffin back up, carry it to the gravesite, and bury it immediately. The gravediggers, reassured by the officer's presence and authority, complied. They carried the coffin to the plot, lowered it into the earth, and shoveled dirt over it until the grave was fully closed. The officer assured Dr. Allard that the matter was officially settled and the sailor was safely resting underground. The doctor thanked the officer, pleased that the disruption was over. Fast forward to about a week later. Dr. Allard had completely forgotten about the entire bizarre episode with the shaking coffin and the frightened gravediggers. It was just another strange anecdote in his years of practicing medicine in a chaotic port town. One evening, after a long and exhausting day at the hospital, Dr. Allard decided to go for his customary night walk. He had a habit of taking long walks late at night to clear his head, and his favorite place to stroll was the local public cemetery. This might seem like a dark or morbid choice of scenery for some, but for Dr. Allard it was simply the most peaceful, quiet, and completely vacant area in the entire town. There were no noisy sailors, no carriage traffic, and no demanding patients. It was just a quiet, open space filled with trees and headstones where he could walk in absolute solitude. He entered the cemetery gates as the sun was setting, casting long, dark shadows across the grassy grounds. He began walking slowly down one of the familiar dirt paths, enjoying the cool evening air. As the twilight began to fade into true darkness, Dr. Allard was walking down a row of old headstones when he looked up ahead and noticed something strange. About 50 yards away, standing near a large ancient tree, was a dark silhouette. The figure was positioned in a way that felt incredibly unsettling. It was standing half hidden behind the thick trunk of the tree, with its body partially obscured and partially exposed, as if it was deliberately lurking and watching. Dr. Allard stopped walking. He squinted his eyes, trying to make out the details of the figure in the dim light. He felt a sudden, cold prickle of unease wash over him. Who would be standing completely still behind a tree in a dark cemetery at this hour? He watched for several seconds, wondering if his own eyes were playing tricks on him in the shadows. But then the dark figure slowly stepped out from behind the tree. It turned to face Dr. Allard directly and just stood there, motionless, staring right at him across the distance. Dr. Allard felt an immediate, intense wave of threat. He couldn't see the person's face, but the posture and the silent, intense stare felt deeply hostile. He decided he was done with his walk for the night. He turned around, intending to walk briskly back toward the cemetery gates and return to the safety of his home. He took a few steps, but the hairs on the back of his neck suddenly stood on end. He had the overwhelming, suffocating sensation that he was still being watched, and worse, that the distance between him and the stranger was shrinking. He stopped, turned back around, and gasped. The dark figure was no longer standing still. It was marching directly toward him, accelerating into a fast run. Terrified, Dr. Allard turned and began to sprint as fast as he could down the dirt path. As he ran, a horrible, high-pitched, agonizing scream echoed through the quiet cemetery, bouncing off the headstones. Dr. Allard risked a quick glance back over his shoulder to see how close his pursuer was, and what he saw froze the blood in his veins. Running hard behind him, with its face illuminated by the faint moonlight, was the young sailor. It was the exact same sailor Dr. Allard had pronounced dead a week earlier. The same man he had nailed into the wooden coffin. Before the doctor could fully process this impossibility, the figure lunged forward, throwing its weight onto Dr. Allard's back. Both men crashed heavily onto the grassy ground. Dr. Allard rolled over, terrified, and found himself staring up into the ghastly, distorted face of the sailor. The man's eyes were wide and filled with a manic, terrifying rage. He reached down and wrapped his strong, thick hands tightly around Dr. Allard's throat, squeezing hard and cutting off his airway. The sailor let out another blood-curdling shriek directly into the doctor's face. Dr. Allard clawed desperately at the hands choking him, his lungs screaming for oxygen, his mind spinning in absolute terror and confusion. How was a dead, buried man attacking him in the dark? The overwhelming fear and lack of air finally took their toll, and Dr. Allard's vision blurred, and he completely blacked out. A few minutes later, Dr. Allard slowly regained consciousness. He sat up suddenly, gasping for air, his hand flying to his incredibly sore and bruised neck. He looked around frantically, expecting to see his attacker, but the cemetery was completely empty and silent once again. There was no sign of the sailor, no footsteps, nothing. It was just a dark, vacant graveyard. Dr. Allard sat there in the dirt, his heart hammering against his ribs, trying to make sense of what had just occurred. Had he experienced a vivid, terrifying waking nightmare? Or had he truly been assaulted by the ghost of the deceased sailor? The physical pain in his throat felt incredibly real, and he was absolutely certain that the face he had looked at was the face of the dead man. He stood up, trembling, and practically ran all the way back to his house, locking the door securely behind him. But the terror did not end that night. Over the next several weeks, Dr. Allard began a rapid descent into absolute madness. Everywhere he went, whether he was at home, walking down the street, or working at the hospital, he would catch sudden, brief glimpses of the dead sailor's face out of the corner of his eye. It was always that same ghastly, shrieking expression staring directly at him. Every time he turned his head to look, the apparition would vanish, but the constant, relentless haunting began to erode his sanity. He felt as though he was being pursued by a vengeful spirit that would never leave him in peace. He became too terrified to leave his house, eventually staying in bed all day, pretending to be physically ill just so he wouldn't have to open his eyes and risk seeing the terrifying face of the sailor. After several weeks of this self-imposed isolation, Dr. Allard realized he couldn't live this way any longer. He couldn't face the prospect of returning to his normal life at the hospital, yet he couldn't remain huddled in his bed forever. The mental torment was completely unbearable. One afternoon, driven to the absolute brink of despair, Dr. Allard walked up to the roof of his house and threw himself off, ending his own life. When his close friends and colleagues learned of his tragic suicide, they were completely shocked. But they also remembered that during his final weeks, the doctor had subtly mentioned to a few of them that he was constantly seeing the face of the dead sailor he had buried. He hadn't told them he believed he was being haunted by a literal ghost, but they could tell he was having a profound mental breakdown related to that specific patient. They went to the local police and explained that they believed Dr. Allard's death was somehow directly connected to the sailor who had died weeks prior. The police, though skeptical of anything supernatural, decided they needed to investigate the situation to provide answers. They decided the only logical starting point was to exhume the grave of the young sailor. The police and a team of workers went to the cemetery, dug up the dirt, and raised the cheap wooden coffin back to the surface. When they pried open the nailed lid, they were absolutely stunned by what they found inside. There was no body. Instead, the coffin was filled to the brim with heavy dirt and rocks. It turned out that the four gravediggers had been entirely correct to be terrified on the day of the burial. The sailor had not been dead when he was brought to the hospital. He had simply been in an incredibly deep, comatose state of alcohol poisoning to the point where his pulse and breathing were completely imperceptible to Dr. Allard, who had made a hasty, incorrect diagnosis. When the sailor was nailed inside the coffin and carried toward the cemetery, the rough movement and the cool air had finally caused him to wake up. Horribly hungover, confused, and terrified, he began thrashing around and moaning inside the dark, confined space. After the gravediggers dropped the coffin and ran, the sailor had managed to use his immense physical strength to break the cheap wooden latch or force the nails out from the inside. He climbed out of the coffin, fully alive, but absolutely furious that the hospital's doctor had carelessly pronounced him dead and left him to be buried alive. To get revenge on the doctor, the clever sailor decided to play a terrifying, elaborate prank. He filled the empty coffin with heavy rocks so that it would still feel heavy, nailed it back shut, and left it for the police and gravediggers to find. He then hid out in town for a week, keeping a low profile and learning about Dr. Allard's daily routines. He discovered that the doctor took nightly walks in the cemetery. The sailor waited in the shadows behind a tree, and when he saw the doctor walking alone, he stepped out, chased him, shrieked like an angry phantom, and violently attacked him, fully intending to make the doctor believe he was being assaulted by a vengeful ghost. After the doctor blacked out, the sailor slipped away, satisfied with his revenge. But he had no idea that his prank would completely break the doctor's mind and ultimately drive him to suicide. After Dr. Allard killed himself, the sailor, realizing the horrific consequences of his actions and fearing a murder charge, immediately fled the island of Tahiti, boarding a departing ship, and was never seen or heard from again. And so, we move from the tropical islands of the Pacific to the cold, foggy streets of historic England. On the night of January 3rd, 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded local pub in the town of Hammersmith, England, feeling completely and utterly annoyed. Thomas was generally a very popular, cheerful, and social young man. He worked hard as a professional bricklayer, and his typical daily routine involved meeting up with his close group of friends at this particular pub after his long shifts. They would usually sit by the warm hearth, drink pints of ale, share stories about their workdays, and laugh together for hours. It was always the highlight of his day, but on this cold winter night, Thomas found himself completely unable to relax. It seemed like every little thing was grating on his nerves, especially the conversation his friends were having. For hours, they had been gossiping and speculating about the latest wave of drama gripping their town, and Thomas had finally reached his absolute limit. Unable to listen to another word of what he considered to be ridiculous nonsense, he stood up abruptly and slammed his heavy glass beer mug down onto the wooden table with a loud, ringing crash. Immediately, the entire pub fell into a dead, tense silence. All conversation stopped instantly, and everyone in the tavern turned their heads to stare at Thomas, who was standing there red-faced and breathing heavily. Feeling a sudden wave of embarrassment for his outburst, Thomas muttered a quick, quiet apology to his startled friends, grabbed his heavy winter coat, and began walking toward the exit. The silence in the pub remained unbroken as he made his way to the heavy wooden door. But just as he placed his hand on the iron latch to step out into the freezing night, one of his friends called out to him, breaking the silence with a tone of genuine concern, warning him to be careful out there. Thomas simply rolled his eyes, muttered a sarcastic reply, and stepped outside into the dark. He had decided he would walk over to his parents' house, which was located just a short distance away. He wanted to sit by their fireplace, warm himself up, and rest for a bit before he had to head back out later that night to perform his nightly duty of meeting his wife. His wife worked long, exhausting hours at a local estate, often finishing late in the evening. Because the streets of Hammersmith had become increasingly dark and dangerous, Thomas made it a point to always meet her at her workplace and walk her safely back to their home. As Thomas began walking down the dark, narrow stretch of Black Lion Lane, he found himself almost entirely alone. Hammersmith was a relatively large and usually bustling town of about 45,000 residents, located right on the western outskirts of London. It was a picturesque, affluent area where wealthy Londoners often traveled to vacation and escape the city's grime. But lately, the friendly and open atmosphere of the town had completely vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating wave of terror. The streets, which would normally have at least some nightly foot traffic, were completely deserted. The reason for this widespread panic was a series of increasingly bizarre and violent night attacks that had occurred over the past 2 months. The townspeople had become absolutely convinced that their community was being targeted and terrorized by a literal ghost, which they had dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. Thomas thought the entire situation was completely absurd, a textbook case of mass hysteria and collective paranoia, and he had been doing his best to simply ignore the endless rumors. But ignoring the panic was becoming virtually impossible, as it had taken over every aspect of daily life. As Thomas rounded a dark corner on his walk, he nearly collided head-on with 2 men walking in the opposite direction. Thomas jumped back, startled, and began to apologize. But before he could speak, one of the men raised a heavy wooden club into the air and screamed at him to get back. The second man had his hand resting firmly on the grip of a large pistol tucked into his waistband, his eyes wide with fear and suspicion. Thomas immediately held his hands high in the air, showing he was completely unarmed and posed no threat. Seeing that Thomas was just a normal local resident, the first man slowly lowered his club, and the second man let go of his pistol. They both looked at Thomas with intense gravity, warning him that it was incredibly dangerous to be walking the streets alone at night, and that he should return home immediately. Without waiting for Thomas to reply, the 2 armed men quickly hurried past him, disappearing into the dark shadows around the corner. Thomas shook his head, muttering under his breath about how ridiculous the 2 armed vigilantes were acting, and continued on his way to his parents' house, which was now just a few doors down. When Thomas arrived at his parents' front door, he reached out and tried the handle. Normally, his family kept the door unlocked during the evening, but tonight it was firmly locked. He knocked loudly on the wood. A moment later, he heard his sister Anne approach the door from the inside. But instead of opening it, she called out through the heavy wood, demanding to know who was standing outside. Thomas called back, telling her it was just him. But Anne refused to unlock the door, stating that she couldn't be sure it was really him in the dark. She ordered him to step back into the street, under the faint light of the moon, so she could inspect his face through the small peephole. Thomas groaned and rolled his eyes, but he complied, stepping back onto the sidewalk and turning his face toward the sky. He heard his sister fumbling with the heavy iron locks, and finally, the door swung open. Thomas stepped inside, and Anne immediately slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt back into place. Before she even said hello, she looked at him with wide, anxious eyes and asked if he had seen it. Thomas let out a deep, frustrated sigh. He had come here to escape the endless talk of the ghost, but it seemed there was no escape. If he had gone to his own home, his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife, would have undoubtedly asked him the exact same question. The town's obsession had started about 2 months earlier when a resident reported seeing a tall, pale, mysterious figure lurking among the headstones in the church cemetery. Thomas had hoped the hysteria would die down when the truth about that initial sighting was revealed a few days later. It turned out that the figure was just the local butcher's son, who had dressed up in white women's clothing and snuck into the cemetery to play a harmless prank on his friends. But instead of calming the town, the revelation did nothing to stop the growing panic. A week later, a local chimney sweep claimed he saw a different figure walking through the cemetery, one that seemed to sink directly into the earth and disappear. After that second sighting, the encounters turned violent. A resident walking near the churchyard was ambushed from behind, grabbed by the throat, and choked by a figure they described as a tall, white, faceless phantom. Shortly after, a carriage driver was forced to flee for his life when a dark creature with horns on its head charged at his vehicle. The terrified driver ran off, leaving his horses and 16 passengers behind. By late December, the situation had escalated to a tragic level. A few days before Thomas's outburst in the pub, a young, pregnant woman had been walking home near the churchyard around 10 o'clock at night. Suddenly, a figure in a flowing white robe and a tall, pointed white hat rose up from behind a low stone wall and grabbed her. The woman was so overwhelmed with terror that she immediately fainted. Her neighbors later found her unconscious on the cold ground and carried her into a nearby home. When she finally regained consciousness, she was barely able to gasp out the details of the terrifying ghost attack before she tragically died from the extreme shock and fright. Following the young woman's death, the town authorities and wealthy residents offered a substantial financial reward for anyone who could successfully capture or kill the Hammersmith ghost. This led to groups of armed citizens, like the 2 men Thomas had encountered on the street, patrolling the dark lanes of the town every night, looking for the phantom. Thomas found the entire concept of trying to hunt and shoot a ghost completely ludicrous, as he was firmly convinced that ghosts did not exist. He believed that some malicious person in town was simply copying the butcher's son's original prank, using the cover of the legend to commit real violent crimes. By 10 o'clock that night, Thomas was sitting comfortably by his parents' warm fire, his eyes heavy with sleep. He dreaded the thought of leaving the warm house to go walk into the freezing, damp night to meet his wife. He casually suggested to his sister, Anne, that perhaps he would just stay the night there and let his wife walk home on her own, assuming she would be perfectly fine. But Anne reacted with immediate fury, screaming at him for being so incredibly careless and selfish. She reminded him that a woman had just died days ago, and that if he let his wife walk alone, she could easily become the next victim of the Hammersmith ghost. Realizing his sister was not going to let the matter drop, Thomas relented. He put his heavy coat back on, grabbed his hat, and stepped back out into the cold night air. As Thomas walked briskly down the dark road, his annoyance boiled over into a quiet, determined rage. He found himself thinking that if he actually ran into the person pretending to be the ghost tonight, he wouldn't run away like everyone else. Instead, he would immediately charge them, tackle them to the ground, and beat them up. By doing so, he would finally unmask the fraud, claim the reward, and prove to the entire town that their terrifying ghost was nothing more than a human coward in a costume. With these thoughts spinning in his mind, he turned onto Black Lion Lane. Up ahead, he noticed a large, dense bush on the side of the road, and he could have sworn he saw a dark shape moving behind it. He stopped and squinted into the darkness. Sure enough, there was a figure crouched down behind the foliage, clearly trying to remain hidden from view. Thomas felt a surge of adrenaline. He was absolutely certain that this was the culprit, the malicious prankster waiting to ambush another innocent victim. Without a second thought, Thomas balled his hands into tight fists and charged directly toward the bush. Meanwhile, back at the parents' house, Anne was standing by the window, looking out into the dark street in the direction her brother had gone. Suddenly, she heard a loud, sharp, masculine shriek of terror echo through the night. Fearing her brother was being attacked, she bolted out the front door and ran toward Black Lion Lane. At the exact same time, a large group of men, including a local night watchman, came running out of the pub. They were being led by Francis Smith, the town's tax collector, who looked pale, terrified, and completely out of breath. Smith led the group down the road and turned onto Black Lion Lane, where they all came to a sudden, horrified halt. Lying in the middle of the dirt road was a motionless body. Crouched over the body was a dark, screaming figure. Fearing it was the ghost feeding on its victim, the men hesitated, but the brave night watchman charged forward, tackled the screaming figure to the ground, and pinned it. The rest of the men surged to the body in the road, hoping they could save the victim. But when they rolled the body over, they saw that Thomas Millwood was already dead, having been shot directly in the face. The investigation quickly revealed the tragic, absurd reality of what had occurred on Black Lion Lane. The figure Thomas had spotted hiding in the bush was indeed a human being, but it was not the malicious prankster. It was Francis Smith, the tax collector. Smith had not been hiding to terrify people. Rather, he was an armed volunteer who had been laying in wait, hoping to ambush and capture the Hammersmith ghost to claim the reward. He was terrified, cold, and on high alert. To make matters worse, Thomas, being a professional bricklayer, was wearing his standard clean white work clothes. To Francis Smith, crouching in the dark and expecting a white-shrouded phantom, the sight of a figure in all white charging at him out of the darkness was the ultimate confirmation of his worst fears. He truly believed he was being attacked by the supernatural entity. In a state of absolute panic, Smith raised his shotgun and fired a single, fatal blast directly at Thomas's face. After firing, Smith was so overwhelmed by fear and adrenaline that he fled back to the pub to gather a posse, believing he had shot the ghost but wanting backup to verify. When they returned, they found Thomas's sister, Anne, who had run to the scene after hearing the shot and was cradling her dead brother's body, screaming in grief. The watchman had mistaken her for the monster. On January 11, 1804, Francis Smith was put on trial, found guilty of murder, and sentenced to death, as the law did not recognize a mistake of fact as a defense for taking a life. However, 5 weeks later, the King of England intervened, pardoning Smith and commuting his sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. The legal implications of this case were debated by scholars for over 150 years, eventually leading to a landmark ruling in English common law establishing that a person may use force in self-defense based on a genuine and reasonable belief of danger, even if that belief turns out to be mistaken. As for the actual Hammersmith ghost, shortly after the tragic shooting of Thomas, the local shoemaker stepped forward and confessed to being the culprit behind the sightings. He explained that his young apprentices had deeply frightened his children by telling them terrifying ghost stories, and in an act of petty revenge, the shoemaker had dressed up in a white sheet and walked through the town at night to scare the apprentices as they walked home from work, completely unaware of the deadly chain of events his actions would set in motion. And so we move forward in time, nearly 2 centuries, to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Lafayette, Louisiana. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 27, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leininger sat in his comfortable living room, trying his best to relax. He, his wife, and their 2-year-old son James had just returned home from their weekly church service, and Bruce was looking forward to a quiet afternoon of resting on the couch. However, relaxation was proving to be completely impossible. His young son James was sitting on the hardwood floor just a few feet away, holding his favorite toy airplane. With intense focus and repetitive motion, the toddler was repeatedly slamming the toy plane nose first into the heavy wooden coffee table as hard as his little arms could manage, shouting, "Plane crash! Plane crash!" over and over again. Bruce watched his son with a mixture of fatigue and growing concern. While he understood that young boys were naturally loud, destructive, and active, James's behavior over the past several months had evolved from normal toddler play into a bizarre, intense, and deeply unsettling fixation. James was not just playing with planes, he was completely obsessed with the concept of plane crashes. Even more concerning were the terrifying, recurring nightmares the boy was having nearly 4 or 5 nights every single week. James would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming in absolute terror, kicking his legs in the air, and thrashing wildly in his bed. When Bruce and his wife would rush into his room to comfort him, the toddler would cry out that he had been trapped inside a burning, falling plane, and that he couldn't get out. This was incredibly disturbing to his parents. James was a very sheltered child who was not exposed to violent movies, television news, or books about warfare. He was only 2 years old, yet his nightmares were incredibly detailed. Even more bizarre were the specific phrases James began to repeat when discussing his dreams. He would look at his parents and say with complete seriousness that his plane had been shot down by the Japanese. Bruce and his wife had absolutely no idea where their toddler could have possibly learned about historical conflicts with the Japanese military. Deeply worried, Bruce and his wife took James to see several pediatricians and child specialists, hoping for some logical explanation. The doctors all gave them the same reassuring advice, stating that toddlers often develop strange, temporary fixations and vivid imaginations, and that James would someday grow out of this phase. They advised the parents not to make a big deal out of the nightmares to avoid reinforcing the behavior. But as the weeks turned into months, James's obsession only seemed to grow stronger and more detailed. Bruce decided that instead of trying to force his son to stop talking about the crashes, he would start asking gentle, open-ended questions to see if he could gather more details about what the boy was actually visualizing. During these quiet conversations, James revealed even more highly specific information. He told his father that he had been flying a Corsair airplane, and that he had taken off from a large boat called the Natoma. Bruce had never served in the military and had no knowledge of aviation, so he had no idea what a Corsair was, let alone if a boat named Natoma actually existed. He began to wonder if his son was somehow tapping into a real historical event. In November of that year, Bruce was sitting in his living room looking through a large, illustrated World War II history book that he had purchased as a gift for his own father. James was playing nearby, and Bruce decided to call him over. He opened the book to a section containing photographs of military aircraft and pilots from the Pacific theater of the war, wondering if the pictures would trigger some reaction in his son. He showed James a page featuring various fighter planes and asked if he recognized any of them. James slowly flipped through the heavy pages with his small hands, looking at the images of planes, but nothing seemed to register. He appeared disinterested until he reached a page near the end of the book that detailed the famous bloody Battle of Iwo Jima. James suddenly stopped flipping, pointed his finger directly at an aerial photograph of the volcanic island, and said, with absolute certainty, that that was the exact place where his plane had been shot down. Bruce felt a chill run down his spine. He immediately began conducting extensive research on the Battle of Iwo Jima, spending hours on his computer and reading historical documents to see if there was any record of a Corsair fighter plane crashing during that specific conflict. But to his initial relief, his research revealed a significant historical discrepancy. According to military records, no Corsair airplanes were actually flown by United States pilots during the Battle of Iwo Jima. The primary aircraft used in that battle were different models of fighter planes. Bruce felt a sense of relief, believing this discrepancy finally proved that his son's nightmares were indeed just the product of a wild, overactive toddler imagination. James had likely heard the words Corsair, Japanese, and Iwo Jima from some distant source and mashed them together into a fictional dream narrative. But Bruce was still curious about the other details James had provided, specifically his claim that he had taken off from a boat called the Natoma, and his occasional statements that his name wasn't actually James, but rather that he was James III. To find out if a ship named Natoma had actually existed during the war, Bruce discovered that there was a retired military vessel called the USS Natoma Bay, which had served as an escort carrier in the Pacific. He also found out that there was an active Veterans Association for the surviving crew members of the USS Natoma Bay who held periodic reunions and kept detailed historical records of their service. Bruce decided to travel to one of these reunions in San Diego, pretending to be a historian writing a book about the ship's combat history, as he was too embarrassed to tell these elderly veterans that he was actually investigating his 2-year-old son's nightmares. While at the reunion, Bruce began asking the veterans if they remembered any pilots from their ship who had been shot down and killed during the war, particularly during the operations around Japan. The veterans directed Bruce to speak with the association's official historian, a man who possessed meticulous records of every single casualty suffered by the USS Natoma Bay crew. Bruce approached the historian and asked if any pilots from the ship had been shot down near Iwo Jima. The historian looked through his records and explained that during the entire campaign, only one single pilot from their carrier had been shot down and killed in action during the operations. The historian stated that this young pilot had been flying a mission near the island when his plane took a direct hit from Japanese anti-aircraft fire, caught fire, and crashed into the ocean. The historian then revealed the dead pilot's name, James Huston Jr. Bruce was absolutely stunned. His toddler, named James, had been screaming in his sleep about being trapped in a burning plane shot down by the Japanese, and now a military historian was confirming that the only pilot from the Natoma Bay killed in that area was a man named James. But Bruce still held on to his skepticism, remembering that James Huston Jr. was a lieutenant junior grade, which would make him James II in his family line, and his son had claimed to be James III. He also remembered the Corsair discrepancy. To find answers, Bruce managed to track down and contact James Huston's surviving sister, an elderly woman named Anne who was living in California. Bruce cautiously explained that he was researching her late brother's military service. Anne was deeply touched and agreed to mail Bruce a package containing some of her brother's personal belongings, letters, and historic photographs from his time in the military. When the package arrived at the Leininger home, Bruce opened it and began sorting through the old black and white photographs of the young pilot. He gasped when he reached a photo of James Huston standing proudly on an airfield in front of a military aircraft. Painted on the side of the fuselage was the plane's model name. It was a Corsair. It turned out that before being assigned to the USS Natoma Bay, where he flew a different aircraft, Huston had been part of an elite test squadron that flew Corsair fighter planes. This explained why the name Corsair was so deeply ingrained in the memory of the pilot. When Bruce showed the photographs of James Huston's military friends to his toddler, the 2-year-old immediately pointed to one of the men and called him by his actual military nickname, a name that had not been written on the photo. Later, Bruce and his wife brought James to meet Anne in person. The young boy, who had never met this woman before, walked up to her and called her by a private, affectionate nickname that only her late brother had ever used for her. Anne was completely overwhelmed with emotion, firmly believing that her brother's soul had been reincarnated in the body of this young boy. James's story would go on to become one of the most thoroughly researched, documented, and famous cases of potential reincarnation in modern history, leaving even the most hardened skeptics struggling to find a rational explanation. And so, we travel back to the freezing, snow-covered landscape of rural Michigan in the early years of the 20th century. On the afternoon of January 5, 1909, a 56-year-old reverend named John Carmichael stood inside the entryway of his cozy cottage. He leaned down to kiss his wife and children goodbye, wrapping his heavy wool cloak tightly over his formal black ministerial suit to shield himself from the bitter winter cold. He stepped outside into the crisp, icy air, climbed onto his horse, and set off down the snow-packed dirt road. Reverend Carmichael was a highly respected figure in his rural community, known for his deep faith, his gentle demeanor, and his tireless service to his congregation. On this particular day, he was traveling to a small town about 9 miles away called Columbus, where he was scheduled to host a major religious revival over the next few days. He was hoping to deliver a series of powerful sermons to inspire the local community and bring new members into his church. As the Reverend trotted down the road, the winter scenery was peaceful and beautiful. He passed several houses where local children were laughing, throwing snowballs, and building snowmen in their yards. Because of his prominent status as the town's reverend, nearly everyone he passed recognized him. Many of the children and their parents waved to him, calling out warm greetings and asking him to stop and chat. Being a polite and caring minister, Carmichael stopped his horse several times to engage in friendly small talk, wishing the families well. But he was also mindful of the time, and he knew he needed to make progress toward Columbus before the sun began to set and the temperature plummeted further. After about 30 minutes of riding, he finally reached a stretch of the road where the houses faded away, replaced by dense forests and open fields. He smiled, looking forward to this quiet, solitary portion of his journey. It was a route he had traveled many times before, and he always cherished this peaceful time to be alone with his thoughts, pray, and mentally rehearse the sermon he was planning to deliver at the revival. But his quiet reflection was suddenly interrupted by the rapid, rhythmic sound of horse hooves fast approaching from behind. Reverend Carmichael turned in his saddle to look back down the road. Galloping toward him was a man riding a horse at a reckless speed. As the rider drew closer, the Reverend recognized him and felt a sudden wave of dread. The man was Gideon Browning, a local resident who was notorious throughout the area for his erratic, volatile behavior and his severe destructive drinking problem. Gideon was wearing a stained, dirty brown shirt under a long, tattered overcoat. His greasy dark hair was slicked back and he had a wide, manic, unsettling grin plastered across his face. He was waving his arm wildly in the air, shouting at the top of his lungs to get the Reverend's attention. Carmichael wanted nothing more than to ignore the man, spur his horse into a gallop, and escape, but his role as the town's minister demanded that he show kindness and compassion to everyone, even the most troubled souls. He pulled on his reins, bringing his horse to a slow walk, and waited for Gideon to catch up. Over the past several weeks, the Reverend had experienced a series of strange, seemingly random encounters with Gideon Browning all over town. It seemed like no matter where the minister went, Gideon would suddenly appear, staring at him with that same bizarre, intense grin. These interactions always left Carmichael feeling deeply uncomfortable, as Gideon possessed a highly abrasive and unpredictable personality. As Gideon pulled his horse up alongside the Reverend, his breathing heavy and smelling faintly of alcohol, he immediately asked if he could ride along with him. Carmichael, despite his internal reluctance, smiled politely and told him he was welcome to join. He immediately regretted the decision. Gideon proved to be an incredibly annoying and relentless companion, talking non-stop without pausing for breath. But what concerned the Reverend more than the constant chatter were the highly personal, invasive questions Gideon began to ask. He wanted to know exactly where the Reverend was going, how long he would be there, how many different church properties he personally owned, and the specific locations of those churches. Feeling uncomfortable but wanting to remain polite, Carmichael answered the questions truthfully, mentioning his destination of Columbus and his ownership of a small historic church in a nearby isolated settlement called Rattle Run. As they rode, the Reverend noticed Gideon reach into his pocket and pull out a large, shiny silver coin. Without breaking his intense, unblinking gaze from the Reverend's face, Gideon began to flip the coin high into the air, catching it smoothly in his palm and flipping it again in a continuous, mesmerizing rhythm. He didn't look down at his hand once, maintaining complete control over his horse while flipping the coin with incredible dexterity. At first, the Reverend was simply impressed by the man's hand-eye coordination. But as the miles passed, Carmichael found himself becoming strangely transfixed by the repetitive motion of the shiny silver metal spinning in the cold air. More than that, the soft rhythmic sound of the coin whirring through the air and slapping into Gideon's leather glove began to have a bizarre, soothing effect on the minister's mind. The Reverend felt his thoughts begin to wander, and a heavy, warm sensation of extreme relaxation washed over him. He stopped answering Gideon's questions altogether, his eyes locked onto the spinning silver coin. He felt as though he was drifting into a deep, dreamlike trance, completely detached from his surroundings and his own willpower. After what felt like hours, the two men arrived at a crossroads where a small general store was located. Gideon caught the coin one last time, slid it back into his pocket, and brought his horse to a stop. The sudden cessation of the sound and motion snapped the Reverend out of his daze, but he still felt incredibly groggy and confused. He had no desire to stop at the store as he was already running late for his revival in Columbus. But when Gideon got off his horse and told the Reverend that they needed to stop and make a purchase, Carmichael found himself nodding and climbing down from his saddle, completely unable to find the will to refuse. Standing outside the store, Gideon looked at the Reverend with his unsettling grin and told him that he was not going to go inside. Instead, he ordered the Reverend to go into the store, use his own money to purchase a brand new sharp hand hatchet, and bring it back out to him. Everything about this request felt incredibly wrong and dangerous to the Reverend, yet he felt completely powerless to say no. He walked into the quiet general store, purchased the heavy metal hatchet from the clerk, walked back outside, and handed it over to Gideon, who slid it into his belt with a look of satisfaction. The Reverend hoped they could finally part ways, but as soon as he climbed back onto his horse, Gideon hopped into his own saddle and announced that they were now going to ride to the Reverend's church in Rattle Run. Gideon claimed he was planning to get married soon and wanted to inspect the interior of the church to see if it would be suitable for the ceremony. Carmichael knew this was a blatant lie, as Gideon was already married, yet he simply nodded and began riding toward Rattle Run, with Gideon following closely behind, once again flipping the silver coin in that relentless hypnotic rhythm. The two men arrived at the small, isolated wooden church in Rattle Run just as the afternoon was fading into twilight. They hitched their horses outside, and the Reverend unlocked the front door, leading Gideon inside. The interior of the church was cold and dark. Carmichael automatically walked to the back of the building to light the wood-burning stove to provide some warmth. As he finished and began walking back down the center aisle toward the entrance where Gideon was standing, Gideon suddenly raised his hand and ordered the Reverend to stop. Carmichael froze in place. Gideon pulled out his silver coin and began flipping it up and down, staring at the minister with an intense, predatory gaze. He told the Reverend that there was no wedding and no marriage. He then ordered the Reverend to raise his left arm high into the air. Terrified and confused, Carmichael felt his arm rise up completely against his own will. Gideon then ordered him to raise his right arm. The Reverend's right arm rose up, leaving him standing in the center of the dark church with his arms outstretched, completely paralyzed and convinced that Gideon had used the silver coin to place him under a powerful, inescapable hypnotic spell. The following morning, around noon, the church's local caretaker rode up to the property to perform his routine inspection. He knew Reverend Carmichael was supposed to be away in Columbus, so he was highly surprised to see a thick column of dark smoke pouring out of the church's chimney. He approached the front door and was alarmed to find it completely unlocked. Fearing a break-in, the caretaker drew his personal pistol, pushed the heavy door open, and stepped inside. He immediately froze in absolute horror. The entire interior of the beautiful white church was completely drenched in blood. Thick, dark pools of blood covered the wooden pews, the altar, and the walls. Shredded pieces of black fabric were scattered across the floor. The caretaker knelt down and inspected one of the pieces of cloth, recognizing a unique silver button that belonged to Reverend Carmichael's formal ministerial suit. He looked down and saw a wide, bloody drag trail leading down the center aisle, curving around the pews directly toward the wood-burning stove at the back of the room. Trembling with fear, the caretaker slowly walked down the bloody aisle, his pistol raised. He noticed a shiny silver coin lying in the middle of the blood-slicked floorboards, but he did not stop to pick it up. He followed the drag trail to the heavy iron stove, which was still radiating intense heat. He reached out, grabbed the handle, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside, resting among the glowing red coals and ash, was a charred human skull. Horrified, the caretaker ran out of the church, mounted his horse, and rode to find the sheriff. Within hours, a massive police investigation was launched. The sheriff quickly connected the murder to Gideon Browning, who had been seen by several local children riding down the same road as Reverend Carmichael on the afternoon of the disappearance, shortly after having a violent public argument with his brother-in-law. A massive, multi-state manhunt was initiated to find Gideon, who was believed to have murdered the beloved minister in a fit of drunken rage. 3 days later, and over 500 miles away, in a quiet city in Illinois, a man entered a local boarding house run by a woman named Miranda Hughes. The man looked incredibly disheveled, pale, and severely ill. He was wearing a tattered, dirty brown shirt under a long overcoat. He introduced himself as John Elder and paid for a room on the second floor. Miranda, concerned by his gaunt appearance, offered to prepare him a hot meal, but the man coldly replied that he was fasting, went up to his room, and locked the door. For nearly a week, he remained inside, refusing to open his door to retrieve the plates of food Miranda left outside. On the morning of January 12th, Miranda was walking across the backyard of the property when she heard agonizing, low moans of pain coming from the wooden outhouse. She ran to the door, calling out to see if anyone was inside. Hearing only weak, bubbly whimpering, she flung the door open and screamed. Inside was John Elder, sitting on the toilet, his throat violently slashed from ear to ear, bleeding to death. The police arrived shortly after the man passed away from his wounds. While searching his clothing for identification, they discovered a blood-stained, sealed letter addressed directly to the sheriff of Rattle Run, Michigan. When they opened and read the letter, the entire mystery of what had occurred inside the bloody church was finally revealed. John Elder was actually Reverend John Carmichael. The Reverend had not been the victim of the murder, he was the killer. According to his detailed confession letter, Carmichael had become completely paranoid in the weeks leading up to the incident, believing that Gideon Browning possessed supernatural, magical powers of tracking and hypnosis, and was using them to spy on and terrorize him. When Gideon flipped the silver coin during their ride, the Reverend's severe, undiagnosed mental illness and paranoia led him to believe he was being placed under a literal hypnotic spell. When they reached the church, the Reverend had stood in the center of the room with his arms outstretched, lost in his own deep delusion of being crucified under Gideon's spell. But when Gideon accidentally dropped the silver coin on the floor, the Reverend believed the spell was momentarily broken. In a state of absolute manic panic to save his own life from what he believed was a powerful sorcerer, Carmichael grabbed the newly purchased hatchet, ambushed Gideon, forced him to strip, and brutally hacked him to death. He then shredded his own black ministerial suit and scattered the pieces, along with his silver buttons, around the church to make it appear as though he had been the victim of the crime. He burned Gideon's head and body parts in the wood-burning stove to destroy the evidence of the victim's true identity, dressed himself in Gideon's dirty brown shirt and tattered overcoat, and fled 500 miles to Illinois. The crushing weight of his actions and his deteriorating mental state finally drove him to take his own life in the outhouse, leaving behind a bizarre and tragic tale of paranoia, madness, and a deeply misunderstood crime. And so, we travel to the cold, wild shores of Lake Superior in Michigan. On the night of August 30th, 1892, a 20-year-old man named Benjamin Trudell climbed into his small, simple bed inside the Deer Park Life-Saving Station. This station was a remote government building operated by the United States Life-Saving Service, which was a historic precursor to the modern Coast Guard. Benjamin and his fellow crewmen, known as surfmen, worked in highly demanding shifts to monitor the treacherous cold waters of Lake Superior, ready to launch heavy wooden rescue boats at a moment's notice to save sailors from sinking ships. Benjamin had just completed a grueling 4-hour beach patrol, walking along the loose, damp sand in the dark, searching the horizon for any distress flares. The walk had been entirely uneventful, but navigating the rough shoreline for miles had left his legs aching and his body completely exhausted. He set his alarm for 4 hours later, which is when he would need to wake up to begin his next shift of monitoring the station's communication lines, and immediately fell into a deep, heavy sleep. But only a few hours into his rest, Benjamin suddenly bolted upright in his bed, his chest heaving, his heart hammering violently, and his skin completely drenched in cold sweat. He looked around the dark room, trembling, trying to orient himself. After a few seconds of breathing the cool air of the station, he realized he was safe in his quarters and that the horrific experience he had just gone through was nothing more than a highly vivid, terrifying nightmare. But the dream had felt so incredibly real, so tactile and visceral, that it took him a long time to shake the lingering feeling of dread. In the dream, Benjamin had been walking along the shore of Lake Superior during his nightly patrol. The weather was absolutely terrible, with a massive, violent thunderstorm raging over the dark water. The rain was pouring down in thick, heavy sheets, and the drops felt like burning acid striking his skin. The visibility was almost zero, with the wind howling in his ears, making it impossible to hear anything else. Suddenly, out of the blinding wall of rain directly in front of him, a man emerged, stumbling through the sand. Benjamin had never seen this man before in his life. What made the stranger's appearance particularly bizarre was his clothing. He was dressed in highly expensive formal and pristine attire, looking as though he was on his way to an elegant high society party in a major city, rather than wandering the desolate, storm-swept shores of Lake Superior. The stranger walked directly up to Benjamin, his eyes wide, wild, and filled with a frantic, desperate intensity. Without saying a single word, the man reached out, grabbed Benjamin's hand, and began to shake it with incredible force and urgency. While shaking his hand, the man turned his head and pointed his other hand out toward the dark, raging lake. Even though the storm made it impossible to see anything beyond a few feet of churning water, the man pointed with such desperation that Benjamin knew there was something unspeakably terrible happening out there on the water, and that the stranger was pleading with him to go find it. It was at that exact moment that Benjamin had woken up, gasping for air. As he sat in his bed, he tried to rationalize the experience. He was a practical, straightforward young man who did not believe in superstition, omens, or the supernatural. He knew that dreams were simply the brain's way of processing random thoughts and anxieties from the day. Yet, no matter how hard he tried to dismiss it, he could not shake the profound, intuitive feeling that the dream had been a literal warning, and that the stranger was a real person in desperate need of help. Wanting to clear his head and shake off the unsettling feeling, Benjamin climbed out of his bed, dressed in his uniform, and walked outside into the cool morning air. He walked down to the beach, where several of his fellow surfmen were completing their morning duties. The weather was beautiful, the lake was completely calm and glassy, and there was absolutely no sign of any storm. Benjamin casually mentioned the bizarre dream to one of his co-workers, laughing about how real it had felt, and his friend simply smiled and agreed that it was a strange dream, quickly moving on to other topics. But around noon that day, the quiet routine of the station was shattered when the front door flew open and a man stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor. The man was in a terrible state. He was soaking wet, shivering violently from hypothermia, his skin was pale and blue, and his face and hands were covered in deep cuts and dark bruises. Benjamin and the other surfmen rushed to his side, lifting him onto a bench and wrapping him in warm blankets. The man was barely able to speak through his chattering teeth, but he managed to explain that he had been a passenger on a large cargo ship that had tragically struck a massive reef and sunk out in the deep waters of Lake Superior late the previous night. The news sent a shockwave of disbelief through the station, as the surfmen had received absolutely no reports of any ships in distress, and their night patrols had spotted no flares or warning signs. The survivor explained that the ship, named the Western Reserve, was a massive steel-hulled vessel that had been traveling far out in the middle of the lake, well beyond the sight of the shoreline. During the night, a sudden, localized, and incredibly violent storm had struck the vessel, causing its steel hull to fracture under the massive waves. The ship sank in a matter of minutes. The man said that he, the ship's owner, the captain, and several other crew members, including women and children, had managed to scramble into a small wooden lifeboat. But the towering waves had quickly capsized the lifeboat, throwing everyone into the freezing, dark water. The survivor had spent the entire night swimming desperately toward the shore, completely blind in the storm, and had only just washed up on the beach a few miles away. He had no idea if anyone else had survived the disaster, but he feared that everyone else was dead. The life-saving crew immediately launched their rescue boats, sailing out into the vast lake to search for any signs of the shipwreck or other survivors. They spent the rest of the day and the entire night combing the cold waters, but their efforts yielded only tragedy. They recovered 4 lifeless bodies floating in the water, but there was no sign of any living survivors. Early the following morning, Benjamin and a small team of surfmen decided to patrol the sandy coastline, hoping that some of the passengers might have managed to swim to shore or that their bodies had washed up on the beach. As they walked down a remote stretch of the shore, Benjamin looked up ahead and spotted 2 motionless shapes lying on the wet sand near the water's edge. The surfmen ran toward the shapes and discovered the bodies of a man and a woman, both lying face down the sand, completely still and cold. Benjamin knelt down beside the male body to roll it over and inspect the face for identification. As he turned the heavy, waterlogged body over, he froze in absolute shock. The face of the dead man was the exact same face of the stranger from his terrifying nightmare. It was the man who had aggressively shaken his hand and pointed out at the raging storm. But the shock did not end there. As the body fully rolled onto its back, the man's limp, stiff arm fell to the side, his cold hand landing directly in Benjamin's palm, mimicking the exact handshake from the dream. The dead man was eventually identified as Robert McKnight, the wealthy part owner of the Western Reserve cargo ship. Records confirmed that the ship had split apart and sunk at the exact hour Benjamin had experienced his terrifying nightmare. Out of the 27 people on board the vessel, 26 had tragically drowned in the freezing waters of Lake Superior, including Robert McKnight, his family, and the crew. The sole survivor was the shivering man who had washed ashore and alerted the station. For the rest of his life, Benjamin Trudell was haunted by the realization that Robert McKnight's spirit had somehow reached out to him across the vast, freezing waters of the lake in his dream, trying desperately to warn him of the sinking ship and beg for rescue. But because Benjamin had dismissed the dream as a mere fantasy, the rescue boats had remained docked in the station while 26 people drowned in the dark. And so we move forward to the cold winter of 1984 in the city of St. Paul, Minnesota. On the evening of December 27, 1984, a 16-year-old high school student named John Bulware sat in the front passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep. The heater was blasting, trying to keep the freezing air at bay, and his friend was navigating the slick, wet residential streets of the city. In the back seat, 2 more of their close school friends were laughing, talking loudly, and singing along to the music playing on the radio. It was a miserable, dark, and incredibly rainy night outside, with the water pouring down in sheets, making the roads treacherous and slick. But inside the Jeep, the atmosphere was filled with pure, unbridled excitement. The 4 teenagers were on their way to a massive concert venue to see the legendary world-famous musician Prince perform live in concert. At the time, Prince was one of the biggest, most influential pop stars on the entire planet, having just released his historic album and film, Purple Rain. But for John and his friends, seeing Prince was about more than just attending a great concert. Prince was a proud native of Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was located right next to St. Paul. To the teenagers, Prince was a true hometown hero, a guy from their very same neighborhood who had defied the odds to achieve international superstardom. His success was incredibly inspiring to them, making them feel like anything was possible in their own lives. They had spent months saving up their money to purchase the highly coveted tickets, and they couldn't believe the night had finally arrived. John turned around in his seat, his face beaming with a huge smile, to say something to his friends in the back seat about how incredible the show was going to be, but right as he turned, his friend behind the wheel let out a sharp gasp, followed by the terrifying high-pitched screech of tires losing traction on the wet asphalt. John whipped his head back around to look out the front windshield. The Jeep's bright headlights were illuminating a massive, thick oak tree directly ahead, and the vehicle was careening toward it at a high speed, completely out of control. John and his friends let out a brief, terrified scream as the driver desperately tried to steer away, but it was too late. The Jeep slammed into the solid trunk of the tree with a deafening, violent crash of tearing metal and shattering glass. The immense force of the impact threw the occupants forward, and everything instantly went dark for John. A few minutes later, St. Paul police officer Brian Coyle and his patrol partner were driving through the neighborhood on their routine nightly shift when a call came over their radio reporting a severe single-vehicle accident on a nearby residential street. The call had been made by a local resident who had heard the loud crash from inside their home. Officer Coyle immediately turned on his emergency lights and sped toward the scene. When they pulled up, the rain was still pouring down, casting a dark, blurry sheen over the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car. Coyle stepped out into the cold rain and walked toward the wrecked Jeep. He was relieved to see three teenagers standing upright on the sidewalk near the vehicle. They were visibly shaken up, crying, and had several minor cuts and bruises on their faces, but they appeared to be otherwise standing on their own. While his partner went to inspect the vehicle, Officer Coyle approached the three crying teenagers to gather information and see if they needed immediate medical attention. The young driver, trembling with fear and guilt, explained through his tears that he had simply been driving too fast for the wet conditions. He had tried to take a sharp turn, but the Jeep hydroplaned on a patch of standing water, causing him to lose all steering control and slide directly into the tree. The driver then pointed a shaking hand toward the passenger side of the wrecked Jeep, his voice breaking as he told the officer that his friend John was still trapped inside the front seat and was not moving or responding to their calls. Coyle immediately left the teenagers and ran over to the passenger side of the Jeep, where his partner was already shining a flashlight through the shattered window. Coyle leaned inside, checking the young passenger John for any signs of life. But his partner looked at him with a solemn, heavy expression and shook his head, stating that the boy had tragically been killed instantly upon impact. Coyle felt a deep sadness for the young life cut so incredibly short on what was supposed to be a night of pure joy. His partner called for an ambulance to transport the three surviving teenagers to the hospital and began taping off the area. As part of their standard mandatory protocol for fatal traffic accidents, Officer Coyle pulled out his official department camera and began taking a series of photographs of the crushed Jeep, the impacted tree, and the surrounding road conditions to document the scene for the official investigation. About a week later, after the tragedy had settled and the official reports were being compiled, Officer Coyle and his partner sat in their office to review the developed photographs of the crash scene. As they flipped through the images, Coyle suddenly stopped on one particular photo, his eyes widening in absolute disbelief. He showed the image to his partner, who was equally stunned. The photograph, which was taken of the driver's side of the Jeep with the door open, captured something incredibly bizarre and unexplained. Floating in the dark air directly above the open door of the vehicle was a strange, glowing, white apparition. When the officers examined the glowing shape closely, it did not appear to be a simple lens flare, a speck of dust, or a reflection of the camera's flash against the falling rain. Instead, the white, misty shape possessed highly distinct, detailed features that bore an eerie, undeniable resemblance to a human face. Specifically, it looked exactly like the face of 16-year-old John Boulware, frozen in a terrifying, wide-mouthed scream, as if the camera had somehow captured the exact moment the young man's spirit departed his physical body at the moment of the fatal impact. The photograph quickly became a sensation, being published in local newspapers and eventually gaining national attention. Even today, decades after the tragic accident, investigators and paranormal researchers continue to study the image, with many firmly convinced it represents one of the most compelling photographic evidences of a human soul leaving the Earth. And so, we travel to the beautiful, sandy shores of Pawleys Island, a historic narrow barrier island located off the coast of South Carolina. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1989, a 70-year-old retired resident named Jim Moore and his beloved wife, Clara, were taking their customary afternoon walk along the beach. Pawleys Island was a tiny, peaceful place measuring less than 4 miles in length and so narrow that it could only accommodate a single main road with beautiful, rustic beachfront homes built on either side. Jim and Clara had lived on the island for decades, cherishing the quiet, slow-paced lifestyle and the tight-knit community where practically everyone knew one another by name. As they walked along the damp sand near the breaking waves, Jim looked out toward the horizon. The sky, which was normally a bright, clear blue, was beginning to fill with massive, dark, and menacing clouds rising high into the atmosphere. Jim knew that a massive, dangerous storm named Hurricane Hugo was currently spinning out in the Atlantic Ocean, and the latest weather reports indicated that it was heading directly toward the southeastern coast of the United States. Living on a vulnerable barrier island, Jim and Clara were very accustomed to hurricane warnings and knew the risks of staying behind during a major storm. They had already discussed their evacuation plan, agreeing that if the local authorities issued a formal order, they would pack up their car and head inland to stay with their adult daughter, who lived on the mainland. For the moment, the weather on the island was still relatively calm, so they decided to enjoy their daily walk. But as they looked around, they noticed that the beach, which would normally be filled with tourists and neighbors enjoying the afternoon, was completely deserted. Almost everyone on Pawleys Island had taken the early weather warnings seriously and had already packed up and evacuated to the mainland, leaving the island feeling like a quiet, eerie ghost town. As Jim and Clara continued their walk, they spotted a single figure walking toward them from a long distance down the beach. This was highly unusual given the circumstances, and Jim kept a close eye on the stranger as the distance between them closed. As the figure drew closer, Jim realized that he did not recognize the man at all, which was highly surprising given how small the island's permanent population was. The stranger was wearing a very long, heavy gray coat that seemed completely inappropriate for the warm, humid coastal weather and a large, wide-brimmed hat that was tilted down, completely obscuring his face. The man walked with a brisk, determined pace, keeping his head low. When the stranger was only about 10 feet away, Jim, wanting to be polite and break the awkward silence of the deserted beach, called out a friendly greeting. But the man in the gray coat did not react at all. He kept his head tilted down and walked directly past Jim and Clara without offering a single word, nod, or glance of acknowledgement. Jim and Clara stopped and looked at each other, highly confused by the man's incredibly rude and bizarre behavior. Jim turned around to look back at the stranger, intending to watch where he was going. But when he looked down the flat, wide-open beach, he froze in absolute disbelief. The man in the gray coat was completely gone. There was nowhere he could have possibly gone in the span of just a few seconds. The beach was a completely flat, wide-open expanse of sand with absolutely no dunes, rocks, trees, or structures nearby to hide behind. To his right was the vast open ocean, and to his left was a low, flat, sandy incline leading to the beachfront houses, which were located far too far away for anyone to have reached them in a sprint. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air, deeply unsettled. Jim and Clara quickly cut their walk short and hurried back to their house, discussing the impossible disappearance the entire way. When they arrived home, they turned on their television to check the latest weather updates. The broadcast was filled with urgent, flashing alerts. The state government had just issued a mandatory, immediate evacuation order for Pawleys Island, warning that Hurricane Hugo had grown into a catastrophic Category 4 storm that was projected to make a direct, devastating landfall right over their area. Realizing they had no time to lose, Jim and Clara quickly packed their essential belongings, locked up their house, hopped into their car, and drove across the narrow bridge to the mainland. Heading directly to their daughter's home save inside their daughter's house, they sat around the television, watching the terrifying news reports of the massive hurricane battering the coast with howling winds and a massive storm surge. To distract themselves from the anxiety of potentially losing their home and everything they owned, Jim and Clara decided to tell their daughter about the bizarre, disappearing man in the gray coat they had encountered on the beach just hours before. Their daughter listened to the story with wide, serious eyes, and when they finished, she looked at them and whispered that they had just seen the legendary gray man of Pawleys Island. Having lived in South Carolina her entire life, the daughter was well aware of the famous local ghost story. According to the legend, which dated back to the early 1800s, a young sailor was returning to Pawleys Island after a long journey at sea to finally marry his beautiful fiancée. As he rode his horse across the marshy shoreline to reach her home, he accidentally fell into a deep pit of quicksand and tragically suffocated. His heartbroken fiancée fell into a state of deep, inconsolable grief. A few days later, while walking along the beach, she saw a man in a long gray coat and a wide-brimmed hat walking toward her. It was her dead fiancé. But as she ran to embrace him, he vanished. The shock of the encounter drove her to leave the island to seek medical help, and the very next day, a massive, historic hurricane struck the island, destroying every single home except for the one belonging to the fiancé. Over the next century, residents of Pawleys Island reported seeing the spectral figure of the gray man walking the beaches immediately preceding every major hurricane that struck the coast. The legend held that the ghost appeared as a protective warning, urging residents to flee the island to save their lives. More importantly, the legend claimed that anyone who saw the gray man and immediately heeded his warning would find their home miraculously spared from the destructive forces of the storm. Jim and Clara listened to the story, finding it to be a fascinating piece of local folklore, but they remained highly skeptical that a ghost had actually saved them. A few days later, after Hurricane Hugo had finally moved inland and the local authorities deemed it safe for residents to return to the island to assess the damage, Jim and Clara made the anxious drive back to Pawleys Island. As they crossed the bridge, they were absolutely devastated by the scene of utter destruction. The powerful hurricane had completely decimated the beautiful island. Roads were washed away, massive trees were uprooted, and virtually every single beachfront home had been reduced to splinters and piles of rubble. It looked like a violent war zone, but as they drove closer to their own property, they let out a collective gasp of pure, absolute disbelief. Standing proudly amidst the surrounding wasteland of flattened homes and debris was Jim and Clara's house. It was completely, miraculously untouched. Not a single window was broken, the roof shingles were fully intact, and there was absolutely no structural damage whatsoever. Every single house on their left and right had been completely leveled by the Category 4 winds and massive storm surge, yet their homes stood perfectly preserved. It was an impossible, defying anomaly that left the insurance adjusters and construction experts completely speechless. For Jim and Clara, there was no longer any room for skepticism. They knew they had met the gray man on the beach, and because they had heeded his warning, their home had been miraculously protected. And so, we arrive at our final story, which takes place in the wealthy, quiet suburb of Old Westbury, New York, during the beautiful summer of 1974. On a warm, sunny afternoon, a highly accomplished and respected 60-year-old surgeon named Dr. Julian Kirchick sat in a comfortable lounge chair beside the sparkling blue pool in his spacious backyard. Dr. Kirchick was a man who dedicated his entire life to the rigorous, demanding field of medicine, spending long, exhausting hours performing complex, high-stakes surgeries at a major hospital in New York City. In addition to his highly stressful career, he was a loving husband and a father to 4 children. Consequently, finding a single moment of quiet, uninterrupted peace to himself was an absolute rarity, and he was determined to enjoy this rare afternoon off. Dr. Kirchick leaned back in his chair, closed his eyes, and felt the warm sun against his face, letting the stress of the hospital slowly melt away. But his peaceful relaxation was abruptly interrupted by a loud, sudden rustling sound coming from a dense row of green bushes located about 20 feet away at the edge of his property. At first, the doctor didn't bother opening his eyes, assuming that the sound was simply being caused by a squirrel, a bird, or perhaps a neighbor's dog wandering through the foliage. He tried to ignore it and return to his restful state, but the rustling sound persisted, growing louder, more rhythmic, and far too heavy to be caused by any small yard animal. Slightly annoyed, Dr. Kirchick opened his eyes and sat up in his chair to investigate. He looked toward the bushes, and his body instantly went completely rigid with a sudden, icy shock of fear. Standing motionless in the middle of the dense green foliage was a tall, imposing figure. The person was completely draped in a heavy, dark, and flowing black robe that covered their entire body from head to toe. The deep hood of the robe was pulled low over their face, casting a dark, impenetrable shadow that made it completely impossible to see any facial features. The figure stood in absolute silence, presenting a deeply ominous, dark, and terrifying presence in the middle of the bright, sunny suburban backyard. A wave of absolute, primal terror washed over the doctor. As a highly trained man of science, Dr. Kirchick did not believe in superstition, ghosts, or the supernatural, yet the overwhelming, instinctual feeling he experienced in that moment was undeniable. He was looking at the literal personification of the Grim Reaper. The chilling gesture felt like a clear, direct message that his time on Earth was drawing to a close and that his death was imminent. Dr. Kirchick blinked his eyes in disbelief, and in that split second of darkness, the robed figure completely vanished, leaving the bushes perfectly still and silent. For the next several weeks, Dr. Kirchick became completely obsessed and consumed by the terrifying encounter. He couldn't sleep, his appetite vanished, and his performance at the hospital began to suffer as he constantly looked over his shoulder, expecting the dark-robed figure to reappear. He felt incredibly isolated, as he knew he couldn't possibly share the story with his medical colleagues or family without them believing he was suffering from a severe psychiatric breakdown. But in October of 1974, just a few months after the terrifying backyard encounter, Dr. Kirchick suddenly developed a persistent high fever and a state of extreme, unexplained fatigue. He underwent a series of comprehensive medical tests, and his worst fears were realized when his doctor diagnosed him with an aggressive, incurable form of leukemia. Dr. Kirchick was devastated by the medical diagnosis, but deep down, he felt a profound, chilling sense of validation. He realized that the robed figure he had seen in his backyard had not been a hallucination or a trick of the light. It had been a literal premonition of his impending death. He decided to share his remarkable and terrifying story with local newspapers, wanting to document the bizarre sequence of events before he passed away. Shortly after the articles were published, Dr. Kirchik tragically succumbed to his illness, leaving behind a chilling, unexplained mystery of a man who was visited by death itself before his final hour. All of these stories, spanning across different centuries, continents, and circumstances, leave us with profound, haunting questions about the true nature of our reality. Whether it is a sailor who survived being buried alive to seek a terrifying revenge, a young man who paid the ultimate price due to a town's tragic ghost hysteria, a young boy who possessed meticulous, impossible memories of a deceased World War II pilot, a paranoid minister driven to madness by a hypnotic coin, a surfman warned in his sleep of a devastating shipwreck, a camera capturing the fleeting spirit of a car crash victim, a spectral figure protecting a home from a catastrophic hurricane, or a doctor visited by a premonition of his own death. These cases challenge our understanding of life, death, and the unexplained. They remind us that there are forces in this world that science and reason cannot always explain, leaving us to wonder what truly lies beyond the shadows of our everyday lives. The absolute shock of the town of Papeete when they found out the doctor had taken his own life was truly profound. The community was small, and everyone relied on Dr. Allard's medical expertise. His sudden, tragic death left a massive, painful void in the local medical care system. The police, when they dug up the grave, did so in front of a small, quiet crowd of local onlookers. When they saw the heavy rocks filling the empty coffin, there was an audible gasp of horror from everyone present. They realized that their own medical system had failed this sailor, and their collective negligence had almost led to a man being buried alive. The police immediately launched a harbor-wide search for the young sailor, checking every single outgoing vessel's manifest, but sailors of that era often used false aliases, and in 1876, tracking a single transient person across the vast oceans was an impossible task. The sailor's friends from the pub were extensively questioned, but they claimed they had absolutely no idea he was still alive, let alone that he had planned such a horrific, retaliatory prank. The tragedy left the hospital board to completely rewrite their procedures for pronouncing deaths, mandating that bodies must be kept for a minimum of 24 hours before any burial could take place to ensure such a terrible mistake would never happen again. Meanwhile, the trial of Francis Smith in historic London became a massive public sensation. The courtroom was packed to maximum capacity, with hundreds of angry citizens gathered outside, demanding justice for young Thomas Millwood. Thomas's wife was completely devastated, having lost her husband on the very road where he was supposed to meet and protect her. The defense argued passionately that Francis had acted without any malice, driven entirely by the severe panic and mass hysteria that had gripped the entire community of Hammersmith. They brought forth multiple witnesses who described the terrifying atmosphere in the town, where families barricaded themselves inside their homes as soon as the sun went down. But the prosecution maintained that a mistake, no matter how genuine, did not excuse the reckless use of a loaded firearm against an unarmed citizen. The jury debated for hours before delivering their guilty verdict. The subsequent royal pardon sparked intense legal debates that lasted for generations, fundamentally shaping the boundaries of self-defense laws in England and across the democratic world. The shoemaker who had caused the entire panic lived the rest of his days in deep shame and isolation, knowing his foolish, immature actions had directly caused the death of a young man and ruined the life of another. The psychological impact on Bruce and his wife during their investigation of James's memories was also incredibly profound. They were deeply religious, conservative people who had never given any thought to Eastern philosophies or concepts of reincarnation. The realization that their young son was potentially channeling the spirit of a deceased war pilot forced them to completely reevaluate their entire worldview. They faced significant criticism and skepticism from their community and local church, with many accusing them of exploiting their child for media attention or fabricating the story. But those who witnessed young James's interactions with the veterans were left completely speechless. At one reunion, the boy recognized several of the elderly men, calling them by their first names and asking specific questions about their missions and aircraft that only a fellow pilot would know. When he met the sister of James Houston, the connection was so deeply emotional and natural that it was impossible to dismiss as a mere stunt. The nightmares finally began to fade as James grew older, as if expressing the memories and bringing closure to the pilot's family had allowed the spirit to finally find peace. The caretaker of the church in Rattle Run also suffered immense psychological trauma after making his horrific discovery. He resigned from his position immediately and could never bring himself to step inside the church building again. The small, isolated community of Rattle Run was deeply scarred by the event, and the historic white church was eventually boarded up and abandoned, with many believing it was permanently cursed by the violent events that occurred inside. The family of Gideon Browning was left in complete ruin, struggling to understand how their troubled but harmless relative had met such a horrific, violent end at the hands of a man they had trusted as their spiritual leader. The revelation of the Reverend's secret madness sent shockwaves through the regional church administration, leading to a quiet, internal review of their clergy's health and conduct. The story became a dark legend in the area, passed down through generations as a cautionary tale of how easily a mind can slip into absolute paranoia and violent delusion when left untreated. The loss of the massive steel ship Western Reserve was also one of the worst maritime tragedies in the history of Lake Superior. The town of Deer Park held a massive memorial service for the 26 victims who lost their lives in the freezing water. Benjamin Trudell attended the service, carrying a heavy, silent guilt that would remain with him for the rest of his days. He retired from the life-saving service shortly after the incident, unable to face the dark waters of the lake that had haunted his dreams. He moved inland, away from any large bodies of water, but his fellow surfmen never forgot the chilling coincidence of his nightmare and the subsequent discovery of Robert McKnight's body. The story of the spectral warning became part of the rich, mysterious folklore of the Great Lakes, told by sailors around campfires as proof that the spirits of those lost at sea sometimes reach out to the living before they slip beneath the waves forever. When the photograph of John Bulwer was first published, it brought a strange mixture of comfort and deep sorrow to his grieving parents. While they were devastated by the loss of their young son, the image of his face floating above the vehicle made them feel as though his spirit had not simply ceased to exist, but had transitioned to a different plane of reality. The local police department faced intense scrutiny from photographic experts who tried to prove the image was the result of double exposure, a chemical stain during development, or a reflection of the emergency lights. But every single test and analysis of the original negative confirmed that the photograph was completely authentic and unaltered. The image remains one of the most famous and highly debated anomalous photographs in the history of Minnesota, serving as a haunting reminder of the fragile line between the physical world and the afterlife. The scientific community also attempted to explain the phenomenon on Pawleys Island after Hurricane Hugo. Meteorologists and structural engineers visited the island, attempting to find a logical explanation for why Jim and Clara's house was the only structure left completely intact. They analyzed the wind patterns, the storm surge flow, the elevation of the property, and the architectural design of the building, but found absolutely no physical reason why the surrounding homes were reduced to splinters while theirs suffered no damage. The house became a local landmark known as the house spared by the Gray Man. Jim and Clara lived in the home for the rest of their lives, always speaking of their encounter with the silent, gray-coated stranger with deep respect and gratitude, firmly believing that their lives and home had been saved by a protective spirit that has watched over the island's residents for nearly 2 centuries. Finally, the reaction of Dr. Kirchick's medical colleagues to his story was deeply solemn. As a highly respected and rational surgeon, his claims of seeing a spectral figure beckoning him were met with quiet concern and disbelief by the hospital administration. Some wondered if the early, undiagnosed stages of his leukemia had caused a neurological symptom or hallucination. But Dr. Kirchick maintained until his very last breath that the experience was completely real and that the figure possessed an undeniable, objective presence in his yard. His tragic death shortly after the encounter left a deep, solemn impression on those who worked alongside him, reminding them of the mysteries of human mortality and the limits of scientific knowledge when facing the ultimate transition of life. The townspeople of Papiti eventually moved on from the tragedy, but the legend of the sailor who escaped his own grave remained a quiet whisper in the taverns along the harbor. It was said that on hot, humid summer nights, when the wind blew in from the ocean, one could almost hear the faint, mocking shriek of a sailor echoing through the old public cemetery. The local authorities never officially closed the case of Dr. Allard's harassment, but with the sailor long gone and no physical evidence left behind, the investigation slowly faded into the archives of the island's history. The hospital itself eventually underwent modernizations, but the basement morgue, where the cheap wooden coffins were once kept, was permanently closed and sealed, a silent testament to the terrible mistake that had set a tragic chain of events in motion. In Hammersmith, the memory of Thomas Millwood was honored by his family, who placed a historic headstone near the churchyard where the ghost sightings had first begun. The tragic story of his death served as a somber reminder to the community of the dangers of unchecked rumors and mass panic. The armed patrols were permanently disbanded, and the town slowly returned to its quiet, peaceful routine. Francis Smith, after serving his shortened sentence, left Hammersmith and lived a quiet private life, always carrying the heavy burden of the tragic mistake he had made on that dark, rainy night on Black Lion Lane. The law that was born from his trial continues to protect the rights of individuals who act in genuine self-defense, a lasting legacy of a dark chapter in the town's history. The Leininger family eventually wrote a comprehensive book detailing their incredible journey with young James, sharing their evidence with researchers and historians around the world. James grew up to be a normal, successful young man, but he always retained a deep, quiet respect for the memory of the pilot James Huston. The sister Anne passed away peacefully, comforted by the belief that she had been reunited with her brother's spirit in his new life. The USS Natoma Bay Veterans Association eventually dissolved as the last of the crew members passed away, but their stories of bravery and sacrifice and the incredible connection to a young boy in Louisiana will live on forever in the annals of history. The old wooden church in Rattle Run was eventually demolished, leaving only a quiet, grassy field where the building once stood. The story of Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning became a dark, historical footnote, a chilling reminder of the devastating consequences of untreated mental illness and severe paranoia. The sheriff's office kept the bloodstained confession letter in their archives for decades, a physical reminder of a case that defied all conventional logic. The local residents eventually stopped speaking of the curse, but many still avoided walking past the old church site after dark, fearing that the restless spirits of the minister and the town drunk still lingered in the quiet Michigan woods. The memory of the Western Reserve shipwreck continues to haunt the waters of Lake Superior, with divers occasionally visiting the deep, cold ruins of the massive steel vessel. The story of Benjamin Trudell's warning remains one of the most compelling maritime mysteries of the Great Lakes, a testament to the strange, unexplained connections that can occur between souls in moments of ultimate peril. Benjamin's descendants still pass down the story of the dream and the handshake, a reminder of the delicate, mysterious balance between our physical lives and the unseen world that surrounds us. The photograph of John Bulware continues to fascinate and terrify audiences around the world, serving as a powerful visual symbol of the mystery of death. The image is frequently featured in documentaries and books about paranormal phenomena, remaining a subject of intense debate among skeptics and believers alike. For the friends who survived the crash, the photo is a deeply personal, solemn reminder of the friend they lost on that rainy night, and the strange, comforting possibility that his spirit survived the tragic impact. The spared house on Pawleys Island remains a beloved local landmark, standing as a physical symbol of the protective power of the legendary Gray Man. The island has faced many more hurricanes over the decades, but the story of Jim and Clara's miracle continues to inspire hope and faith in the hearts of the residents. The silent, gray-coated stranger is still spotted on the beaches before major storms, a timeless guardian watching over the vulnerable coast, reminding us that sometimes the spirits of the past are still working to protect the living. Dr. Kerchick's legacy in the medical community of Old Westbury remains strong, with his children and grandchildren continuing his tradition of service and dedication to others. His story of the robed figure is still shared by his family, not as a source of terror, but as a deeply mysterious, meaningful event that brought a sense of preparation and closure to his final months. It stands as a powerful reminder that our lives are brief, precious, and surrounded by mysteries that we may only truly understand when our own time comes to face the darkness. All of these remarkable accounts remind us that our physical world is only a small part of a much larger, deeply mysterious reality. They challenge us to keep our minds open to the unexplained, to listen to the quiet warnings that come in our dreams, and to respect the powerful, unseen forces that shape our lives and deaths. These 8 individuals, separated by time and geography, were all touched by the bizarre and the supernatural, leaving behind a legacy of mystery that will continue to captivate and haunt us for generations to come. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.